with Gordon Manley.
Hello, good morning. Britain's former Prime Minister, Sir Edward Heath, has died at the age of 89. He led the country between 1970 and 1974 and took Britain into Europe. But his premiership was a difficult one. His time at number 10 was marked by confrontation with the unions, which resulted in numerous strikes. Sir Edward was eventually succeeded as Tory leader by Margaret Thatcher. He died at home in Salisbury a week after celebrating his 89th birthday.
He was one of the political giants of the second half of the 20th century. He was the last Conservative leader to have served in the Second World War. And as Chief Whip, as a senior cabinet minister, and of course as Prime Minister, he made an enormous contribution to the political life of our country. As you say, he will always be remembered as the Prime Minister who took us into the European Economic Community, but he will be remembered for many other things as well.
He was the one of the 8 Prime Ministers that I've served who wasn't going cap in hand to Washington. He stood up to American views and wasn't just enchanted by the White House lawn, as so many others were conservative and indeed Labour. He was the Prime Minister who took us into Europe, and I was the last of the Labour MPs who went into his lobby to support him in going into the community on October the 28th, 1971. And that, in an odd way, created a bond between us.
It's a sad evening for England because Ted was a great Englishman. He was a great Brit, but he was a great Englishman. He loved our country, he loved our Queen, he loved our institutions, and he took that love of our country wherever he went in the world. When I was his PPS back in the mid-80s, I travelled with him a lot in Europe and met many of the people who were, I think, almost stunned by the rate of progress on their great project. And he was never other than loved wherever we went.
Sky's political editor Adam Bolton says Sir Edward Heath was respected by both his friends and adversaries.
You can get a measure of Ted Heath's importance from the enemies who've praised him tonight. Margaret Thatcher described him as the first modern leader, by which she meant he was the first non-aristocrat coming from a humble background, grammar school educated, to lead the party. He was, of course, the politician who gave the break to the young Margaret Thatcher, a grammar school girl, by appointing her to his cabinet. Norman Tebbit praised him for his abilities outside politics. He was an organ scholar at Oxford and in the world of music went on to conduct some of the world's greatest orchestras as a guest. Meanwhile, while Prime Minister, he managed to become a world-class yachtsman on his Morning Cloud boats. As Prime Minister, he had one big achievement and one big failure. The big achievement was finally seeing Britain join what was then the European Economic Community, what became the European Union. The failure was in the confrontation with the trade unions. That led to the 3-day week as the miners took on the government. Ted Heath asked the question, who governs Britain? And the answer in 2 general elections in 1974 came back, probably not Ted Heath. Harold Wilson was back in power. Ted Heath served for 50 years in the Commons, half of that after he'd been Prime Minister. And he's as famous for that period, so-called longest sulk in history against Margaret Thatcher's leadership. He was a thorn in her side, especially over Europe, and the party took her course. Figures who could be seen as Ted Heath's protégés, like Michael Heseltine and Douglas Hurd, failed to become leader when she finally fell. But Ted Heath remained a dutiful House of Commons man to the end. He presided as Father of the House over the election of the current Speaker. And even in retirement in his 80s, he continued to be sharp. He was one of the most caricatured politicians, known for his heaving shoulders when he laughed and his booming voice. Ted Heath was a big figure and the last real link to the era of the Second World War. It was what he saw as a young man in Hitler's Germany and what he experienced as a soldier, which led him to commit his political career to unifying Europe, so it never happened again.
Baghdad has suffered its worst weekend of violence for many weeks. More than 150 people have died in the last 48 hours in a wave of suicide bombings. The worst violence since April has prompted heavy criticism of the new government for failing to maintain security.
Even by Iraq's violent standards, this week has been one of its bloodiest. A wave of suicide bombings has claimed more than 200 lives and injured more than twice that number. The attackers were indiscriminate in their choice of targets: security personnel and ordinary Iraqis, men, women and children. On Thursday, 13 children were killed as they collected sweets from American soldiers. A car packed with explosives was driven into a US military vehicle. They all lived in a poor suburb in eastern Baghdad. And more bloodshed was to follow. As worshippers gathered late yesterday evening to offer prayers at Al-Musayyib's main mosque, a suicide bomber was to carry out the worst single attack in Iraq for months. Before detonating the explosives strapped to his chest, the bomber opened the valves of a fuel tanker. The explosion set off a fireball that engulfed the neighborhood. The streets were filled with shoppers. Desperate parents threw their children from burning houses to save them. Metal hooks were used to drag people from their blazing cars. Most of the victims were burned beyond recognition. And as the first funerals took place today, more bodies were being recovered from the gutted buildings. As Al-Musayyib mourned, the suicide bombers targeted Baghdad. No fewer than 4 separate attacks rocked the capital today. 3 policemen were killed in this attack. A car bomb blew up just meters from the Electoral Commission building. About an hour later, a second suicide car bomb exploded near a police convoy in the Bayer district of the city. 7 people were killed here. The injured, and there were many, some seriously, were rushed to the local hospital. Almost lost among today's carnage was news from Iraq's special tribunal. The country's former dictator Saddam Hussein has been charged for the first time in connection with a massacre in 1982. A date for his trial will be announced soon. But that will do little to abate the violence. Insurgents loyal to Abu Musab al-Zarqawi have pledged to intensify their deadly campaign of terror. Ashish Joshi, Sky News.
The Ministry of Defence has named the 3 British soldiers who were killed in a roadside bomb in Iraq. They were Private Philip Hewitt and Private Leon Spicer, both from Tamworth, and Second Lieutenant Richard Shearer from Nuneaton. All 3 came from the 1st Battalion, the Staffordshire Regiment, based at Tidworth in Wiltshire. The Defence Secretary John Reid has paid his own tribute to the dead soldiers. He repeated his assertion that Britain could start a troop pull-out from Iraq within a year, but he insisted that British troops will stay in the country as long as it takes.